Hello everyone and welcome. Thank you for joining us this Wednesday evening for Retrofit in conservation areas. We're just going to wait for a few more people to join before we go ahead and get started. So please do grab your drinks, your coffee, tea, whatever you need at 7 o'clock on Wednesday. We're halfway through the week. And if you wouldn't mind putting your microphone on mute while you're not speaking, just to help us with the interference, that would be wonderful as well. But yeah, I hope that you guys haven't had too busy a week. I know that I'm definitely glad it's getting to that time of the week now, and we've only got 2 more days left. Whilst we're letting people into the event, I will just go through some housekeeping briefly before we get started.
2 hours.
So just to make you aware, this webinar is being recorded. We do try and record all of our webinars so that people can access them afterwards, and it will be uploaded on our website. So we'll post a link to that and we'll send it out after the event if you want to catch up on any of the conversations we've had. But yeah, if you don't want to be in the recording, you can switch your video off, and you can also rename yourself on Zoom to something anonymous. Thank you all for joining, and thank you so much for donating to this event. If we could just put ourselves on mute while we're not speaking, that would be super helpful in terms of the interference. If you see me coming along, I may just mute you. Apologies for jumping in there, but it just helps us keep things running a bit more smoothly. We're still having a few more people join. We have got about 50 people we're expecting today. So we are almost there, and I'll just keep letting people in while we get started. But I think, should we go ahead and jump in, Julia, and get started?
Yes, that would be great. If you put up our lovely wintry picture, that would be great.
There we go. So yes.
So yeah, welcome everyone to this, the first in our series of webinars on retrofit in conservation areas. In the lead up to COP26, when we're only all too well aware of the urgency of climate adaptation, we trust these sessions offer timely guidance for those who care for older properties. I'm Julia Rantry, chair of the Brookman Road Conservation Area Society, and our area was in South London, in Deptford area, was one of the first to be designated in Lewisham after Blackheath, which is much better known, as an indicator of its significance as a heritage asset in the borough. And its ensemble of Victorian terraces feature rare unity and consistency, particularly of roofscape. The untrammeled charm of the area is clear as you travel along Brookmill Road, down Friendly Gardens, along St John's Vale or Albin Road. But it's old housing stock with challenges of maintenance and energy efficiency. We initiated these webinars so that we could learn more about how to address these issues effectively, whilst protecting the heritage qualities of the properties of which we are stewards. So it's been a real pleasure to work with South London Community Energy and Nadia in particular on preparation and hosting the webinars, and with our speakers today and indeed next week from Historic England, who I'll be introducing in due course. And a great thanks to all of you. And we're also delighted to have in attendance representatives from many of the amenity societies in Lewisham and some from Greenwich and further afield, together with architecture and conservation professionals and individual homeowners from different parts of the country and across London, mostly in southeast London, but from further afield as well. So Nadia, if I can hand back to you, project manager at SELSI, South East London Community Energy Co-op, to give further introduction to tonight's session and the series as a whole. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Julia. It's been really great to work with Brookman Road Conservation Area Society on these events. And we have got 2 webinars, as most of you will be aware, but for those that aren't aware, our next webinar is on Tuesday, the 9th of November. So do go ahead and sign up to that event through the Eventbrite link. But just to have a look at what we're covering in those 2 sessions. So we're going to kick off today with an introduction to retrofit. And we're going to introduce you to why you should be looking at retrofitting your home to begin with. And more specifically for today, why conservation area homes need that specialist approach. Now, every home is different, but conservation area homes have a particular challenge that we need to tackle. So need that specialist attention around them. We'll be looking at some of the policy context across London through our guest speakers from Historic England, and we'll also be looking at the planning and regulatory sort of landscape for retrofit work, especially in our areas, and what it means to have a house that is future fit, a house that is ready to deal with a future of a constantly changing climate, and how to make your home really comfortable whilst sort of looking after the heritage aspects and the beautiful aspects of our local conservation area homes. So we will also have a panel discussion with a live question and answer at the end. So if you have got any questions as we go through the webinar, please do drop them in the chat section and we will get to them during the panel discussion. For our next session, we will be looking in more detail at those sort of practical solutions around retrofit. So if you're looking to really forge ahead with your retrofit and look at exactly what steps you need to take, exactly what technologies and you know, how it's going to look if you're living in your home whilst you're retrofitting it, that webinar is for you. We will also have Lewisham Council presenting at that webinar on their work within the retrofit space, and a few examples of homeowners who have lived through the retrofit. So knowing exactly how it is going through this process, because it really is a journey. So in terms of today's agenda, we have just had the introduction from Julia. And next thing we're going to jump straight into is a presentation from myself and my colleague David, looking at an introduction to retrofit and why fabric first is the approach that we want to take. We'll then get into a very quick quiz, and for the quiz, please don't be shy. We would love to see your answers in the chat box on these questions that we've got for you. It's just so we get an idea about who's here, where people are at with their retrofit, and how we can support even further with this in our events in the future. Then we'll have a presentation on traditional buildings and their place in climate change from Joanne Williams, and also planning for retrofit in conservation areas in London from Alfie at Historic England. So those are going to be 2 really sort of setting the landscape for retrofit in terms of how conservation areas are in a bit of a different situation, living in a bit of a different framework to most other homes. And then we'll go to a short break from 8 to 8:15. And then we will come back and have the panel discussion, and you can get all your questions answered live. I'm sure some of our speakers will have different views to the other, but that's one of the good things about our webinars. You know, we have that diversity, and to be honest, we will give you a true reflection of what we think the answers are, rather than what we think we should be saying about a topic. So I hope that you find some value in that as well. And then a quick roundup and close. So just a quick reminder for the people that have just joined, if you could keep your microphones on mute, it would really help us with the interference. And please feel free to have your videos on or off as you like, but just to make you aware that the webinar is being recorded. So let's get straight into it. An introduction to retrofit. So myself and my colleague David, who is one of our retrofit coordinators at CELSI, will be presenting on this topic. And we're going to try and cover within sort of 25 minutes, which is not a lot of time, an update on why you should really look at retrofit. I mean, all of you are obviously already looking into this because you're at this webinar. Who we are at South East London Community Energy and what the services are that we've developed to help people through this process, how you can start planning your own domestic retrofit, external wall insulation and internal wall insulation. I'm expecting they're definitely going to be some of the big topics for today's event because they apply to quite a lot of our homes in South East London, considering the period that they're built in, and finally finishing off on what you can do today. Why are we talking about retrofit? I don't know how much you guys have come across this number before, but 22% of our carbon emissions in the UK come from homes. One of the reasons that we have been hit so hard by the increase in gas prices recently, and one of the reasons why we're seeing that reflective on our energy bills, is because we use so much gas to heat our homes. And that's a really big problem in terms of our carbon emissions. Retrofit is important, not just because we need to reduce carbon emissions from our homes, but because most of the homes that we are going to be living in between now and 2050 have already been built, a very large proportion of them. So we can't look at building new homes as a solution. We can't look at building new homes to zero carbon even as a solution. We have got a big retrofit task ahead of us. So there are sort of 4 key areas that I like to break things down into when we're looking at retrofit. The first is, what do you heat your building with? And I should caveat this with, these are in no way in any specific order. All 4 of them are very important to retrofit. But the first I look at is, what heating system are you using? Most of us will be using in London, a gas boiler. Some of us will also have more sort of polluting appliances to heat our homes, like wood burning stoves. So it's really important to look at, how do we heat it and what could we be using instead? The second thing, which people really don't think about, but is one of the most important, is how our homes actually lose heat. Or if it's a positive scenario, how they hold on to the heat after we've heated them up. The third one is generating renewable energy. We're going to focus on that a little bit more in the next webinar. So if you're interested in that area, do sign up to the next webinar. And finally, energy efficient appliances and smart home appliances. Another thing that we really don't think about as much as we should be doing. How efficient is our fridge? How efficient is our kettle? How efficient is our washing machine and our boiler? These are things that we're using day in, day out. Even our light bulbs. Do we ever think about them? Do we ever think about if we've got A-rated or B-rated appliances, if they've got those little stars on them? Something to consider. But what we will be focusing on today is really mainly the fabric first approach and fabric efficiency. So these are 4 areas that we're going to be looking at in some detail if we're talking about retrofit. And those are where we lose heat from. So the biggest place we tend to lose heat from is the walls. And please do pick me up on this if I'm wrong, David, but I believe it's about 35% of heat loss in homes is from our walls. After that, we've got heat loss from our roofs or our lofts. and then also windows and gaps, basically around doors, around different areas that aren't sealed. And finally, our floors, where we lose sort of 10 to 15% of our heat. So just before we get stuck into the details of retrofit and the introduction to that, and David will sort of go through some of the more technical aspects that I can't cover for you, but a little bit about who South East London Community Energy is. Well, we were set up back in 2014, quite a long time ago now for a community energy group. But we were set up by a group of local residents who had this vision or this mission in mind. And that is a low carbon future where everyone has access to affordable energy and has a say in how that energy is produced. So as we've gone through the years, most of our work has been focused on supporting schools to go green with solar panels. We've also ventured into supplying LED lighting for community buildings, and now energy advice for businesses, in addition to our work on the Future Fit Homes programme, which I run. Our fuel poverty alleviation work is one of the busiest and biggest areas. Throughout lockdown, we have more than doubled our team size to support homeowners and tenants in London who are really struggling to choose between paying their bills for heating their homes and putting food on their tables. And you would be surprised to find out, or I was very surprised when I found out, that actually South East London is one of the worst areas in the whole of Europe for fuel poverty. So we've been really busy over lockdown trying to tackle this issue. We've had an amazing number of volunteers support us. That's over 10,000 hours, but I won't go into that because we've actually stopped counting how many hours our volunteers have put in. It's gotten a bit too much. But anyway, about our service to support homeowners. So Future Fit Homes was developed really because we couldn't find anything out there that was giving people advice on how to go through this process of retrofit. We wanted to make sure all of the advice that we gave was tailored, because we know that every house is different. How every person wants to do their retrofit is different. But we also wanted to be able to offer some impartial advice and be an organization that people can trust to come to for advice. So we don't try and sell any particular technologies. We don't have any affiliation with particular builders or anything like that. So we will always try and be impartial. We've got a team of trained advisors that you can speak to. Those are qualified as retrofit coordinators, retrofit assessors, domestic energy advisors, and more. We are also members of a cooperative of organizations that work in the retrofit space called Retrofit Works. You might have heard of them if you've been working in this area before. And most importantly, all the surpluses that we generate from this program go back into alleviating fuel poverty and working on our carbon emissions reduction work. There are a number of services that we've developed around the Future Fit Homes program. The first one that you should all book onto as soon as you can is get that free half-hour phone call with one of our team. This will really just help us go through what exactly you're looking for, how far you are along in your retrofit journey, and it will help us understand where we can direct you in future. Of course, you can call us up and ask us about pretty much anything to do with retrofit, and we'll try and find the information for you. Going on from that, we offer one-to-one advice. That's charged at £59 an hour at the minute, and we can also come and do that in your home rather than online. We also offer a thermal imaging survey for £299. I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail in a moment. Energy performance certificates, you guys are probably familiar with what those are. And retrofit coordination, so we can help you manage your retrofit project all the way through. through another organization, which I'll talk about in a little bit. We've got lots of webinars and a blog on our website with free information. And just to highlight what the customer journey usually is, you will have come to one of our events or found us online, have that free half-hour phone call, and then we can decide what direction is best for you. When we find people have a budget of over £10,000 for those retrofit for their own project, we tend to take them down the route of a deep retrofit, which we work with an organization called EcoFurb on. That means you'll get a whole house plan, you'll have a retrofit coordinator from our team assigned to your project, and they will help you the whole way through the project. We also have a cheaper option basically for people that don't have £10,000, and not everybody does have over that amount to invest in their homes, and that is the sort of DIY and kickstart route. So you can get that hourly advice from us, as much or as little as you need, but the aim is to get people to a place where they can make their home fit for the future and then ready to go with retrofit. This is one of our services, which is the thermal imaging survey. This has been really popular over the past few months because you can literally see exactly where your home is leaking heat from. You also get a video and a report afterwards with photos on what corrections you need to make. These are some of our past events, which you can check out on our website. And this is a quick sort of review of our the good things people have said about us. So if you don't believe me, you can go on Google and check what people have said about our service. So I will pass over to David now to talk us through some of the more in-depth areas of retrofit.
Hello, everyone. So what are the motives for retrofit? Well, reducing our carbon footprint is obviously the one that springs to mind. Giving your property greater thermal mass, its ability to retain heat and heat up more quickly and lose heat much slower. Also, when you retrofit a property and put insulation in it, you have to balance it with the appropriate ventilation, which will give you greater air quality, better thermal comfort, and it can increase the value of your property. It depends on who wants to buy it, of course. Next slide. In terms of the listed buildings and conservation areas, I think we have other speakers on that, but every building, different local authorities have different building regulations in terms of retrofitting or changing the external appearance of the building. So you have to check up with your local authority to see what is permitted and not permitted. Talk to the neighbours. If you're a freeholder, you have to get permission. That depends. That all varies. And you know exactly what you want to do to your property, what budget you've got, and how long you anticipate that you're going to make changes in terms of retrofitting to your property. So those are all considerations. Next slide. So the first thing to do is assess the dwelling, and you must look at the fabric. A heat pump is great, but it's useless if you don't thermally insulate the whole building. You have to look at the whole fabric. It has to be a fabric first approach, and then balance the ventilation based on that. And that's not something that a mere mortal can do. It has to be done by a professional. What you can do, you can do your own you can do stuff like putting air door brushes on the bottom of doors. You can put draft proofing around your front door if it's a leaky old front door that's bowing. But I would always say to people that really, if you're going to do it properly and you've got a reasonable budget, you should actually get a professional in, a retrofit coordinator who will manage the whole process and take the risk, do a risk assessment, and then balance all the different measures that you're going to have over a medium-term plan. Okay, Nadia, next slide. I've only got 12 minutes to do this. First thing first is your building may have damage to the existing fabric. You may have cracks in the brickwork. You may have some rot you've got to deal with in joists. You may have there's all sorts of other issues, but you've got to get the fabric in the right state before you can start retrofitting. So that's really important, and that can be. And if you have a retrofit coordinator on board, he will say to you, "Okay, these are the things you have to do before you can start the process." So that's important. Next slide. External wall insulation is obviously the walls lose the most heat because it's the biggest space. It has the most space in terms of where the heat loss is going through. So it's much easier to do external wall insulation than internal wall insulation. There's no decanting of residents. They don't have to move out. It's all done externally. Scaffolding is put up, but there are certain things you have to do. You have to make sure you have sufficient overhang of the roof, and that all of the whole process is done properly. All of the services and the external pipes and down pipes, it's all refitted properly, and you have to make sure the detailing is done properly. There will be sometimes you might have to have planning permission, but not really. And the actual external change to the building is not really significant. Some people prefer brick slip. You can have brick slip, but it costs an enormous amount of money. But external wall insulation is the way to go, and there's less risk with interstitial condensation. It's less risky, and it allows the building to breathe better. Carry on. Internal wall insulation is inherently more risky. It requires redecoration, moving of plugs and sockets and skirting boards and architrave, and then the redecoration, and it often requires people to move out. It's where you can do it, or where you can't do external wall insulation, then you have to do that if you're going to get a really good performing fabric. So there's vapor open or vapor closed. It depends on the evaluation from the retrofit coordinator as to whether you go for man-made or natural products, and there are different fixing methods to that, but it's a lot more hassle than external wall insulation. So wherever you can do EWI, do it, not IWI, but in certain cases you can't. Most of the problems with thermal bridging, in other words, cold spots, are where you get a junction between a floor and a wall or a roof and a wall. So the insulation has to be continuous. So you have to pay particular attention to these junctions. So there are various ways of insulating ground floors. You might have a raised timber floor or a solid floor. So, every house is different. And you know, sometimes you can't actually get access under a raised timber floor. So there is another option. You could send a robot underneath it, and it will spray expanded foam onto the underside of the floorboards. So, you know, you can use, again, you can use natural fibers, or you can use man-made, and it depends. It depends on, you know, what result you want to achieve. Okay, next one. You know, what would I do? You know, it depends on the property, of course. I would draft proof wherever I could, because, you know, that makes the building less leaky. But some people just wouldn't know how to even begin to do that. But there are many things you can do, and actually YouTube is a great resource for that. There's loads of builders and manufacturers of various products will post videos of how you can just you know, do little things that would help in terms of draft proofing. So that's worth looking at. And there's so many things like pipes that go out of the building, flues, where pipe work goes out and it leaks air in, and, you know, that's gonna increase your space heating requirement, because your building becomes inherently more leaky. Okay. So if you're in any doubt and you're not quite sure how to approach this, then you know, as Nadia mentioned before, we can come to your property, we can do an evaluation, have a look at the whole thing, have a poke around, look at the building fabric, look at your heating system, what ventilation you've got, and then make recommendations to you on that. You may, and it depends on budget. You know, if we all had enough money, we would all do it, particularly if we're environmentally conscious. So, you know, things like radiator reflectors, things like simple things like that can save 25, 30, 40 pounds a year, depending on how many radiators. So, you know, our in-house advice service is very good. I would always recommend a thermal imaging survey, so you can actually see exactly where your property is leaking heat, and you'll see all the thermal bridging. So you don't have to spend an enormous amount of money to come up with a starting point where you're informed.
That's great. Thank you so much, David. That was really useful. So yeah, just to sort of round off our presentation, as David mentioned, you can come and book a free half-hour call with us through our website, and I'll drop the link in the chat shortly. If you just want to have some reading, some bedtime reading, we've got lots of blogs, and we have lots of webinars that we've done in the past that you can also find on the website. But we would really love you to go out and get some measures installed as soon as you can. It's getting to winter now. It's the right time to get this stuff done. But if you don't know where to start, just do something small. You can get a free quote for solar panels on our website. And you could buy sort of small items like radiator reflectors. We do have a discount code for some radiator reflectors, so I'll send that out in the email post-event. But anything that you can do in terms of small measures, every little bit really does make a difference. Bonus point I've added on the end, if you could write us a review after this webinar as well, and let us know what you thought of it, what you enjoyed, and if we have any improvements that we can make, definitely get in touch and we will have a conversation about those. So we're not going onto a break just yet, but we will go for a quick quiz. So I can see people have already started getting the conversation flowing in the chat, and I'm just going to sort of pause the sharing for a minute. And I wanted to ask you guys a few questions about where everyone is at in their retrofit journey. So the first question I have, and if you could post your answers in the chat, that would be great, so everyone can see our answers, is Whereabouts are you based? If you're in London, can you tell us what borough you're in? And if you're outside of London, tell us what town, city, what area you're in. So we can help people with these services across South London, and we've also expanded the services to North London in Haringey area in partnership with the local group there. But it's always interesting to see where people are coming from, because we do get people from all across the country join these webinars. And I'm sure that a lot of people have heard about this through Historic England as well. I'm sure there's people from outside of London there. So, wow, okay, we've got quite a few people in Lewisham, a few in Southwark, we've got Blackheath Village, Camberwell, Brockley, Charlton. Okay, Brookmill Conservation Area, Brookmill Road Conservation Area, great. Catford, where I am, wonderful. And is there anyone from outside of London?
Is that someone from Bracelet, California?
No, that would be crazy. What time would it be in California right now? That's dedication to the webinar there. Waking up at some crazy time in the morning. Devon, amazing. Ealing, great. Lovely. Okay, so second question, if you haven't answered the first one yet, do go ahead and put your answer in. The second question is, have you started on retrofit at all? So when I say have you started at all, I know a lot of you are thinking about it, I know a lot of you are seeking information, but have you gone and installed anything in your home yet for energy efficiency, retrofit? So that could be anything as small as some radiator reflectors like I was talking about earlier, water saving shower heads, or okay, we've got some people that have replaced their windows, their doors, some solar panels, great. You've got some insulation going on and some draft proofing. Wonderful. Okay, quite active. Miriam's tried to book thermal imaging, but it got turned down because it's not cold enough yet. That is completely right, Miriam. That is a really good point to add. So we conduct our thermal imaging surveys when there is a big difference between the temperature outside and the temperature inside. That's because it makes it so much clearer to see where you're losing heat from in your home. So if you are interested in getting a thermal imaging survey done, do get in touch with us and we will reach out to you as soon as it gets cold enough outside to get that started. Okay, wow. Anna, solar panels, radiator reflectors, LEDs, new windows, insulation and draft proofing. Amazing. Okay, so there's quite a mixture there. Got underfloor heating, insulated ground floor. John, we know how big that is. That's a lot of work. Someone does have internal wall insulation. Great. Okay. And the last question I have for you is, what is the biggest barrier for you right now? So if you wanted to do retrofit tomorrow, what is the biggest barrier? Okay, there we go. So we've got quite a few people saying cost, money. We've got convenience, that's an interesting one. Knowledge about the topic. Okay, consent for listed buildings. It's a big one. So hopefully you will find out a little bit more about maybe how you can get around that, those issues in Historic England's presentation. The time, Robin says, I need a project manager to manage it for me. we can completely, understand that. It's a big thing to embark on, definitely. Technology issues, balancing heritage with retrofit, interesting. And Anne is saying, actually living in the house, she would have to move out of her house because she's in a conservation area. John says his partner is the biggest barrier he has. She doesn't like the look of the air source heat pump. John, we've seen some very cool covers for air source heat pumps. Some very nice looking covers. I don't know how expensive they are, but maybe that's something you need to have a Google about. Okay, lovely. Thank you everyone so much for your input. Do keep the questions coming, and I will have a look at them and get them ready for the panel discussion so we can get some more information on what your questions are and get some thoughts from our speakers. But for now, I will pass back to Julia to introduce the next speakers, if that is okay. Julia, if you're speaking, you're on mute.
Clever. Right, we're delighted to welcome our speakers this evening from Historic England, Joanne Williams and Alfie Stroud, and I'll introduce them separately. And their presentations, just as a reminder, will be followed by the panel discussion. So please keep your questions until after both presentations, until the panel discussion. So first of all, Joanne Williams, who's historic building surveyor, will speak about traditional buildings and their place in climate change. And Joanne is a chartered building surveyor working within the climate change adaptation technical team at Historic England, advising and supporting government, homeowners and conservation stakeholders on how to adapt and manage their buildings against the climate emergency. Before joining Historic England, Joanne worked for the National Trust and Winchester College. She's particular interest and experience in implementing energy efficiency measures and emergency prevention work against flooding and fires. So I hope nobody will be affected by those in the immediate future. Joanne, thank you.
Hi everyone, hope everyone's having a good day today. Nadia's sharing my slides for me, so that'll make it a bit easier on me. So as I've just been introduced, my name is Joanne Williams. I work in the climate change team at Historic England. Nadia, if you go to the second slide, please. So Historic England is a government agency and we champion and protect England's historic buildings and its places. The climate change adaptation team is fairly new. We were formed in 2020 and we are here to support government, local councils and those working in the conservation sector. We do this by finding solutions to minimise our carbon footprint through the reuse of our traditional buildings. We have a very busy remit looking at different elements from energy performance in buildings through to low and zero carbon heating. We support by writing guidance, responding to consultation papers and undertaking research into new areas, including materials and technology. If you go to the next slide, please, Nadia. Lovely. So traditional buildings account for around 30% of the UK building stock. Many, but not all of these buildings are listed. So traditional buildings are usually defined as those constructed before 1919. This is using solid wall construction and traditional materials. Brookman Road was largely constructed in the 1850s and 70s, thus they are constructed of permeable materials and do not have barriers to external moisture as the building itself breathes. Modern construction, which are buildings like those to the north of Friendly Street, are built in the 1960s, will have been constructed with cavity wall systems and their materials are impermeable and incorporate barriers to external moistures. Barriers could include tanking, damp-proof membranes or damp injections. Modern construction also heavily relies on mechanical extraction to remove water vapour formed by the activities of the occupant. Go to the next slide, please, Nadia. Lovely. Moisture movement is one of the biggest elements to consider. We all understand that walls and roofs keep rain out, but we don't all appreciate the issue with the internal relative humidity and the impact this can have on the building fabric until it's a bit too late. Many traditional buildings have characteristics that enable moisture as a vapour to pass through them. They achieve this by absorbing moisture in the air and then releasing it via evaporation. When working efficiently and designed with adequate ventilation, evaporation will keep dampness levels in the building low. This prevents decay of the fabric and creates a good environment for the occupant. Using vapour barriers in permeable materials such as cement, tanking and emulsion paints must be avoided when undertaking repairs. or making any alteration to a traditional building. Using these materials and technologies will act as only a plaster and cause damp and decay further down the road. Retrofitting any traditional building requires an understanding of the building and proposed materials to ensure that they don't cause damage in the future. However, many retrofitters recommend the installation of impermeable materials which direct moisture in an unexpected way. When coupled with poor ventilation, we start to see excess moisture trapped in the house. Next slide, please, Nadia. Lovely. Heritage is not a barrier, as I see some of you have been saying, to reducing carbon footprint, and it should be celebrated. We have some of the oldest building stock in the world. Traditional buildings have proven themselves. I can hear someone else. Traditional buildings have proven themselves as reliant and durable, and they have been around for a very long time. Where carefully managed, these could stay for another hundreds of years into the future. They are categorized as pre-industrial revolution buildings, meaning that they were built during a time that occupants were low carbon users, before electrical power and central heating was available. The global building sector is actually the third biggest source of greenhouse gases, and they are responsible for 40% of all carbon emissions. People in the sector view traditional buildings as energy poor, but this is not the case, and reusing traditional buildings is a more carbon sensible thing than to demolish and build new. Studies undertaken by Historic England show that reusing traditional and historic buildings is essential to cutting the UK's carbon emissions. There is actually a strong argument that retaining traditional buildings, as they hold high levels of embodied carbon, will cut the UK's carbon emissions. These materials are also far more durable than modern equivalents, in which reduces the frequency of repair and refurbishment, requiring less energy and carbon to maintain them in the long term. Furthermore, the repair, maintenance, reuse and adaptation of redundant buildings can revitalise and enhance town centres, bringing benefits to the local community. Demolishing old buildings not only sees the loss of already embodied carbon, but produces millions of tonnes of waste, has high energy costs, guzzles resources and accounts for 26% of the world's plastic consumption. Next slide, please. So maintenance. The largest variable in energy efficiency is occupant engagement. The construction industry can only control the way the building performs and have no control over the occupants' actions. This is such as occupants who had the heating on full, but the windows wide open. Lack of maintenance can directly affect the energy efficiency of a building, mainly because building's fabric, which is damp, will conduct heat more readily than when dry, thus losing heat from the building. So what can you do? Ensure you take your basic maintenance. Minor repairs that might cost relatively little now, left long periods of time, can cause extensive damage and end up costing far more. Ensure that all maintenance considers the type of the materials used and the methods, and ensure that compatible solutions are being proposed that don't lead to acceleration of decay or diminishing the character of the building. Extreme weather caused by climate change is going to be an ever-increasing risk, and it's going to put a greater strain on the external envelope of the building, which is why it's now even more important to ensure that mortar and render repairs are undertaken and window and roofs are well maintained. Next slide, please, Nadia. There you go. One of the biggest climate change planning risks to the heritage environment and traditional buildings is the EPC's drive for maladaptation and the use of fossil fuels, preferring to refer to energy cost rather than carbon emissions. It's important that when considering alterations to take a whole building approach and not a fabric first. For example, if you were to replace your windows for double or triple glazing and didn't insulate your house, you will see little benefit. In fact, studies actually undertaken in Historic England's own offices found that altering the mechanical and electrical systems on the site made a substantially better impact on the EPC ratings and energy emissions, rather than doing extremely fabric first invasive approaches. What we recommend is commission an EPC assessment of your building. This will provide you with a baseline of how your building's efficiency is offering, and it will offer you recommendations on what you could do. It's not the EPC that harms the buildings, but the inappropriate actions that are taken. Easy wins like draft proofing on windows and doors, swapping to LED lighting and insulating around your hot water cylinder are all very non-invasive energy improvement measures, and they do not require detailed design. Installing insulation in the loft, as long as thermal bridging and ventilation is concerned, is also a fairly easy solution to install. Where your building needs more extreme measures, such as wall insulation, to improve its energy efficiency, time should be taken to assess and inform the decision process. Homeowners and consultants should consider each element of extreme measures and what impact they will have on the building's natural performance. It's not as simple as going to the shop and buying off-the-shelf insulation, I'm afraid. There are no simple one-size-fits-all approach to reducing the carbon footprints of traditional houses. Homeowners need retrofit options that suit their house to not only reduce energy bills, but reduce their carbon emission and waste. It means planning and employing experts with an understanding of your building construction and the building's climate risk factors. Don't use anyone who just offers you a quote or recommendation without first undertaking a site visit. Consider using fewer new materials with large carbon footprints, which are often imported from abroad, and instead use natural, durable and recycled materials. Next slide, please. So how much should you spend on a retrofit project? I noticed that's been mentioned in the chat a few times. The key to successfully reducing the carbon use of your building is by understanding the fundamental elements of the building and how you as an occupant use it. For example, why insulate a building that only requires heat for such short periods of time? So, for example, small churches that are infrequently used. Every building is unique, much like its owners, so we'll need an individual approach. Thus, Historic England promotes a whole building approach when considering retrofit. The most important outcome of most retrofit works is that homes are warmer for the people who live in them. However, consideration needs to also be factoring in preventing overheating, which is now recognised as one of the biggest problems it's going to face the south of England, where well-insulated and airtight new buildings, recently retrofitted houses have overheated significantly. Further, by improving the insulation and airtightness of a house, coupled with an improved ventilation, results in warmer and more humid air, which will create mould and condensation. This is both detrimental to the building fabric and its occupants. One element of retrofitting that does have a one-size-fits-all approach is the use of lime plasters and mortars. Lime plasters and mortars have been around for centuries and are the most appropriate product for a traditional house. The use of lime is not only important to support the building to breathe, but lime plaster has been proven to be a more sustainable option in areas of high risk of flooding. When a tanked building endures flooding, the removal of the plaster and the insulation, as well as the drying of the concrete floor, can take up to several months. But case studies have actually proven that lime plastered walls and lime concrete floors react completely different in flood situations. One building in particular that I've seen recently had the floodwater reach nearly to 1 metre high, yet within 5 weeks, the occupant was able to move back in. If you go to the next slide, please. Finally, heritage designation should be seen as an environmental opportunity. Heritage designation is often seen as a barrier and something that gets in the way of achieving sustainability. But in actual fact, the fact that we have some control over these buildings allows us to take a more considered and sustained approach, and is based upon understanding the whole life carbon approaches to our buildings. Historic England offers lots of support and guidance on its website. These technical guidance notes are constantly under review and being updated. I've shared some of them today with the organisers and they'll be able to pass them on to you. So I just want to say thank you for your time and I hope that was a good lecture.
Thank you so much. That was really, really, really insightful. I am just going to be conscious of time and pass straight over to you, Alfie.
Let me introduce Alfie first, perhaps. Great pleasure in introducing Alfie, and who's an Inspector of Historic Buildings and Areas in the London Development Advice Team at Historic England. He'll speak about planning for retrofit and conservation in London. Alfie's previously worked as Senior Conservation and Design Officer at the London Borough of Camden and in Heritage at the Integrated Urban Consultancy Allen Baxter Limited. He has a long interest in conservation of the historic built environment as part of sustainable development, and recently pursued research on the theme as part of Europe-wide MSc studies. So Alfie, thank you, and over to you.
Thanks for the introduction, Julia, and thank you, Joanne. So we've had a great overview of principles, risks, and good rules of thumb in traditional building retrofit from Joanne. But my presentation, which I'll try and share with you now, hopefully it will work, is going to look at how we can plan for this in London. So I'm not going to make very concrete suggestions. I'm going to stay at a more planning level, and I'm going to briefly review net zero policy and standards, how they line up with heritage protection and why that's important, what work has been done and what resources are available to guide conservation sensitive retrofit. And so also maybe point at what we might hope to see next for retrofitting conservation areas in London. Generally, policy remains very focused on technology and interventions for energy efficiency. So you probably heard this week about the government's proposed boiler ban and £5,000 heat pump grants. But we could replace all the UK's boilers tomorrow and still be wasting that energy from leaky homes. So there's more to do. Alternatively, we could demolish or radically renovate the whole of the UK's housing stock, but end up wasting more embodied carbon than we save. So how can we promote the holistic whole building approach that Joanne's begun introducing, and that puts retrofit and conservation hand in hand, which considers embodied energy as well as energy efficiency and promotes future-worthy retrofit, which responsibly uses the carbon and cultural resource of our existing built environment. Next slide, yes. Well, there are signs that policy is tentatively catching up with this need, especially in London. The Mayor of London's zero carbon deadline of 2050 makes whole life cycle carbon calculations. So that more holistic approach, thinking about embodied energy too, the policy standard for emissions calculations. The new London plan also has energy hierarchy policies. The energy hierarchy is on the right there, that triangle, at the top of which is energy efficiency, be lean, as it's termed, which is good news for you in Lewisham, where the Mayor's Energy Efficiency Fund of £500 million has granted £7 million to the council for water source heat pumps to be fitted to 2,000 council-owned homes. But moves like these have their limitations. One is that, like so much other good work that is being led by local authorities, that Lewisham project is centred on their own social housing stock, over which they have control. So what about private householders, which are, for the most part, the people that live in conservation areas? Another limitation is that the Mayor is constrained by his planning remit, which is mainly over major new developments. And it's these to which the hierarchy and emissions policy mainly applies. The hierarchy objectives become increasingly large scale as well. So after being lean with energy, it's being clean with renewables. And these are sort of dependent on national and international trends and factors. So what about the small scale stuff of existing homes in conservation areas? Well, there are opportunities for London conservation areas in the London Plan emissions policy. Because of its focus on the energy needed for large new development, when they say zero carbon in the London Plan, they mean not absolute zero, but net zero, which leads to that yellow tip of the policy hierarchy. It sort of looks like a precarious fulcrum, actually, which is offsetting. Since 2016, the GLA has applied a mechanism by which big developers can offset their zero carbon shortfalls to reach net zero. And the London boroughs operate these carbon offset funds and spend the money. So far, the funds haven't been getting dispersed enough because retrofit efforts are generally quite sluggish. But the mechanism is embedded again in the new London Plan, and the guidance states that its main priority is to be reducing energy demand in existing buildings, and another priority is whole house retrofit. So there's a potential source of funds embedded in London planning policy. So I'm not going to talk about listed buildings in heritage, because that's a whole different discussion, really. I would like to make the case that conservation areas, though, could and should be a priority for our retrofit efforts, and that they're a really great place to do retrofit sensitively, and might be a good place for those offset funds to go. So first, let's try to characterize conservation areas geographically and by building type. It's clear that they're dominantly made up of traditional buildings. In London, they're concentrated, as you can see from that map, in the historic centre, we might say roughly in its 19th century boundaries, with a few historic town centres and parks that have since been absorbed in the outer boroughs. And if we look at time instead of space on that bar chart at the bottom, sorry about the resolution, it gives an idea of how much the housing stock generally is composed of traditional buildings that Joanne described. So considering their structural properties more than worrying about their style, we can say that around 30% of English houses have solid wall construction right into the 1930s stock. And these will be the homes that compose the overwhelming majority of conservation area houses. Now, Joanne has already made a large part of my case about conservation areas for me by explaining how positive the properties of these traditional buildings are in terms of breathability and moisture control, the methods and materials that are used to build them, so timber, masonry, lime, solid walls. These typically have low levels of embodied and high levels of sequestered even carbon. So these are typologies which hold lessons for how we need to build now and in the future. Learning how to retrofit these buildings, I would argue, will give us the skills and knowledge we're going to need. Another good reason to focus retrofit in conservation areas, or really try to promote it, is the fact of the heritage protection itself. The aesthetic of net zero architecture, as the architectural historian Barnabas Calder has pointed out. I really recommend, by the way, his new history of architecture, understood through the lens of energy. He's pointed out that the aesthetic of net zero architecture actually needs to be the aesthetic of our current built environment. Thinking about whole life cycle carbon, clearly we need to retrofit existing buildings more than we need to demolish buildings and build new high performance ones. So the future will look like the buildings we have now, ideally. And I'm also going to be a little bit provocative now and say that extensions have a carbon cost too. So the constraints that conservation area designation imposed on extensions can be positive. It is possible to integrate retrofit with your kitchen extension, for example, but often minimal change will be the lowest whole life cycle carbon way to proceed. So the constraints on development imposed by conservation areas are a virtue for climate change adaptation. More good reasons come from design. The government's latest planning reforms establish making beautiful places as a policy objective for the first time. And this is very much based on contextual character and appearance. This is what conservation areas are for. The legislation that controls them says they are areas of special architectural or historic interest, the character or appearance of which it is desirable to preserve or enhance. So retrofitted conservation areas are, in a sense, the policy model for a sustainable and beautiful urban future. So much so optimistic, I do, of course, want to acknowledge that there are special challenges that conservation area retrofit faces. And I'll just mention a few in brief because I know this is going to be part of our discussion later. Because, for example, because of the history of urban development, conservation area homes are more likely to be flat or terraced houses. So one study suggests around 35 and 34% respectively of homes in conservation areas are flats or terraces, compared to more semi-detached and detached homes on average across England outside conservation areas. So living in close quarters with shared walls and floors can make retrofit trickier. Another challenge is that local planning policies and guidance remain weak on climate change adaptation in general. There's a lot of work still to do. Some London boroughs have lately added sustainability to their conservation and design officers' titles, but by and large we, and I count myself among these people, are not retrofit specialists, but we tend to be conservation specialists. So, and conservation area appraisals which address retrofit are very rare in my experience. So there's a skills gap amongst decision makers, as well as amongst crafts and tradespeople at the moment, because we just haven't been doing this enough yet. And it applies even to EPC inspectors themselves, as Joanne began to talk about, who receive quite limited training typically. As Joanne said, they're a good baseline, but they have measurement biases, such as thinking about cost and U values, which can fail to take account of the retrofit approaches that work best for historic buildings. All the same, as the blue table at the bottom there shows, the minimum EPC requirements are set to rise. So we do have to deal with them, even in conservation areas. Conservation areas do have exemptions available, like listed buildings do, but this is by exception, and it doesn't apply to landlords, so it's not something to rely on. Building regs, Part L, are also a little bit out of date in that they were prepared at a time when the energy grid looked very different, and were suffering from, and they suffer from the same problems, building regs, of the way they measure and the intrinsic biases they have. So they're a limited guide to what we need to do. All of this translates, as Joanne also mentioned, into a lack of up-to-date knowledge amongst insurers, for example, and mortgage brokers, and so higher premiums and borrowing costs potentially, and sometimes bad advice unsuited to traditional buildings. Increasingly, there's no excuse for this, because I just want to point out some of the freely available data on conservation and climate change, which is starting to far outstrip the state of planning and industry responses to the need for retrofit. And just a few online data sets here that are freely available for you to use. One project called Colouring London is a UCL effort to map London's building ages. That's fantastic in the bottom left there. And there are two GLA interactive maps shown here as well. The London building stock model, which they've built in collaboration with UCL, which shows building by building data on EPC ratings. And the climate risk map in collaboration with Bloomberg, which tries to map overheating and flood risk, so various kinds of climate change risk. Amazing resources, and they're free online. But where do we start with designing more holistic ways to actually do retrofit, working with the grain of our traditional building stock? I'll close with a few pointers. There are a baffling arrays of councils, boards, bodies, networks, campaigns producing strategies and reports, and even those like the National Retrofit Strategy, bottom left there, which sound official, tend to be quite aspirational and somewhat partial in their focus. HE and other specialist bodies produce great guidance, and here's a plug at the top for all of the amazing things you can find free on our website, and our teams like Joanne's are commissioning and digesting all the latest research in order to share it. There are webinars available free online, for example, you can see bottom right, which I really recommend. As to practicalities though, sometimes the research is old, it's often esoteric, sometimes very academic. For instance, I found a fascinating study called Low Carbon Retrofit of a UK Conservation Area Terrace, introducing a pattern book of energy saving details, which sounds excellent, but it's an academic paper on a one-off project, and it's 11 years old now. So there's still a gap. There are architects who have been building practical experience for decades already. You'll hear from one, Arboreal Architects, in the next webinar in this series, but there are more. The Superhomes Network is an initiative of the National Energy Foundation to recognise and rate retrofits, and amongst many useful resources on their website, there's this map of case studies, bottom left. Several of those case studies are from the last decade or so, and by the London architects Pruitt Bisley, who have done several retrofits in conservation areas in London. There are some pictures on the right from some of their projects. The one I found most interesting, and we'll follow up, is those top two images, an energy savings trust project for the Old Oak Estate conservation area in Acton, which aimed to develop vernacular working details for retrofits in the conservation area in collaboration with the council's conservation officers, so that they would be approved and would be transferable across the properties. It also took an explicitly realist brief to work with locally available skills and with a limited budget, which for them was £20,000 per dwelling, which I acknowledge is quite high. But presumably costs will be falling. And the point is, it was, try not to be all bells and whistles. Which brings me to my conclusion. In London, we've seen that the big picture is that policy is beginning to support coordinated retrofit programs. The Mayor's retrofit funds are potentially growing and unspent generally. And also we've seen that conservation areas are an invaluable resource full of traditional buildings and materials which we need to develop retrofit skills for the future and to design new low carbon places. Better still, conservation areas group buildings together, batched up into parcels which tend to have similar histories, materials and types. They have similar planning controls and even similar climate contexts. Conservation areas are therefore perfect for potentially developing carbon and conservation sensitive transferable toolkits of skills and pattern books of working details. We just need the projects which will try and do that. Both retrofit and conservation have this in common. Good practice begins with a holistic understanding of the building and of its context. And there is abundant heritage expertise and knowledge specific to every conservation area, not least council conservation officers and conservation area appraisals. So I hope we see more collaborative experiments with retrofit within the helpful and healthy constraints and the community of building types that conservation area designation provides. Thanks.
Alfie, thank you very much for that really useful and insightful talk, and even, dare I say it, shades of optimism in terms of potential benefits and assets that conservation areas might represent in this area, and even attract offset funds, who knows. But really, really interesting. Thank you. We are going to propose a 10-minute break now, and perhaps you can prepare your questions, attendees, to put in the chat, which we'll then propose to the panel when we get back. And there'll be an additional panel member to the speakers, which is Joanna Eccleston, who's Senior Conservation Officer for Lewisham, who will also be joining in case there are any specific Lewisham conservation questions for her. Thank you very much. See you in 10 minutes or 8:20, yeah.
Hi everyone, just a quick message to say that we are coming back from our short tea break, so please finish up getting your teas and coffees and get comfortable for the panel discussion. I will hand over to Julia to introduce the panel discussion.
Hello everybody, welcome back, and to our panelists, who are Alfie and David and Joanne. So Alfie and Joanne from Historic England, David from Selsey, Nadia will be there to answer questions if there are any particular to her, and also Joanna Eccleston will be joining us from Senior Conservation Officer at Lewisham Council. So Nadia, you're going to field the questions.
I think so, and thank you everyone for all the questions that you are putting into the chat section. It's really useful, and we will try and get to most of them. I don't think we'll have time to get to all of the questions we've got, because there are quite a few and a lot of them are quite detailed, but we will definitely do our best. So just to kick off here, the first question that I had for you guys really was, what are some of the biggest challenges that you see for homes in conservation areas to retrofit? Or maybe it's not a big challenge, but the most common challenge that you see for homes in into conservation areas. Anyone really keen to jump in with the answer on that one? Don't forget to unmute, by the way.
I'll offer a quick first response. As I was trying to argue in my presentation, I think that the conservation area, the constraints, the planning controls can actually be a real benefit, because it's in the back and forth, it's in the testing and trying to get permission for things that we find out what fits for each particular location. And so, but I think that's a challenge, because actually our planning departments are really understaffed generally and stretched. I speak having been a conservation officer, so I know. And so, one of the challenges is going to be the additional time it takes, and the investment of time it will take to get advice from the council and to work with the council, but it's worth it. I think I just suggest that is a challenge, and it'll take patience.
Okay, that's really interesting. Joanna, do you want to jump in there?
I was just going to say, one thing I've learned a lot working with the conservation officers and the historic buildings team from the Heritage Department that work with them is we are all working on this, and that's the key area. What your conservation plan is at the moment might not be the conservation plan in 5 years, and it's understanding that people in this situation, we can do energy efficient measures. There are ways of doing it. We've proven that through secondary glazing instead of triple glazing, and development of things like double glazing are becoming thinner, so the impact is less visual and aesthetics to the buildings. So bear with us, we will get there and support you. That's the main point.
Okay, great. So the technical solutions are providing some sort of ease on those sort of planning rules that people are trying to get around. David, I know that we've dealt with a lot of different clients and some people in conservation areas. I'm just wondering if cost is one of those barriers that you think people see to retrofit in homes in conservation areas as well.
Yeah, definitely. But also when you have an architectural, beautiful building that was built in, say, 1890, and it has those sort of architectural features that you want to keep, people would rather lose a finger than lose those to an EWI solution. So you have to look at keeping the heritage, the look, and also providing the performance that you need to reduce your carbon footprint. But every property is different, and every client has a different set of needs, and it's a deeply complex subject. I have to say, it's not something you can just scattergun approach, and it's very tough to try and sell a retrofit solution, particularly in old buildings. It's they have their own sort of way of they have their own equilibrium, and you've got to take that into account.
Okay, and that kind of, focusing on different homes and different solutions for different people, that kind of leads me to my next question. And hopefully, Joanna, you could provide some insight on this from Lewisham's point of view to begin with. But what do you think the biggest drivers for homeowners are in actually doing retrofit? What do you think is most important to them to actually get through that process?
I think foremost it's realizing you're not alone. I know in climate change a lot of people say one person can't make a difference and it needs to be the government that does, and that's not the case. One person can make a difference. It's a daunting subject. Even working in it, I think it's a daunting subject. If you do the smaller measures, like I said, though, these are really key aspects you can do to ultimately lower your energy efficiency. And then when you need to get onto the bigger ones, or if you need to, then it's about finding people that will support you, be it consultants or the government. And the local council, yes, very busy, always happy to have a chat with people and give pre-application advice. You can go to Historic England, we've got guidance pages. You can also talk to our guidance site, and you've also got the amazing heritage inspectors. There's a vast array of people out there that you can talk to get the support from.
That's really useful. And Joanna Eccleston, I mean, what do you guys see in terms of the work you're doing on retrofit at the minute? Do you think is climate change the biggest driver for people at the minute, or is it other things? And for Lewisham in general?
Well, I'm sure everyone's got their own individual reasons for wanting to do this, haven't they? But a large part is wanting to be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. The increasing costs of fuels will become more of a reason why people want to do this. And increased awareness generally about the options and how homes work are all drivers. I mean, everybody here will probably have their own unique reason and approach to dealing with this. In terms of what we see in the planning department and in conservation generally, we have seen a lot of people tackling windows first. So we've had a lot of applications for replacing single glazed historic windows with double glazed windows, which we allow. Generally that can be done in conservation areas without harming the appearance. And in a lot of our 19th century conservation areas, the timber itself, whilst it was slow grown and therefore really durable, and we have to take into account the embodied carbon in those historic elements of the building. This is something that people have started their projects on, it seems, taking out the single glazing and getting the benefits of higher energy efficiency in the window component of their building. We haven't seen many proposals for external wall insulation yet. Obviously, people are probably doing lots of things that we don't know about because they're internal to their buildings and they don't need permission. There's quite a lot of proposals for solar photovoltaics on roofs, and in a lot of cases in conservation areas, those won't need planning permission either. So that's another thing that people can do in conservation areas without coming up against sort of constraints.
That's really interesting. And just on this topic, while we're on it, of external wall insulation, internal wall insulation, you know, I think a lot of people would believe that the general consensus is you can't really touch external wall insulation if you live in a conservation area. What is your perspective on that? I mean, in the pictures that we saw in David's presentation, there was a rendered wall, which appeared to be the back wall of the house, then having its external wall insulated. To what extent have you said you haven't received many applications on this? What do you think the response would be in this space? Are there options to look at external wall insulation, or is it a definite no-go?
It's difficult to give a general response to that because what we're looking at is preserving the significance, and each conservation area will have the significance will be vested in a different way. But generally, if we're talking about traditional brick buildings, Alfie and Joanne have picked up this issue about the way that moisture moves through traditionally single skin brickwork, and that's one of the principal concerns with external wall insulation, well, and internal as well, really, is it has to be done really, really well to avoid the problems of condensation, overheating, mold growth internally. So, and I think Alfie also said that a lot of our conservation areas are comprised of terraced houses. So effectively, they are one building with lots of different dwellings inside them. And from a visual perspective, but also from a sort of building physics perspective, it's very hard to put wall insulation on and create an end to that wall insulation without causing problems at that junction, because your neighbouring house might not have wall insulation. So you're always going to have these sort of compromised places visually and technologically in a lot of building stock in conservation areas, because it's terraces or you've got flats within a house. So those are some of the problems, on top of the issue of the character and appearance of a building, which often is sort of vested in the historic brickwork, the lime mortar or rendering, the uniformity of groups of houses. So I think it's very tricky to meet the goals, both set down in legislation and national planning policy, which is of preserving or enhancing these areas that have been designated as historically and architecturally important, at the same time as improving their energy efficiency using external wall insulation. But as Historic England says, a whole house approach is the way to go, and it gives everybody lots of options in terms of this whole toolkit of different measures you can use. And a lot of them will be cheaper and less carbon intensive anyway than external wall insulation. So, someone from Chelsea said, start with the low hanging fruit, but do it, understanding how you live in the building, how you use it, what you're wanting to achieve yourself.
That's a really, really interesting point. And just going off of that, so Sophie Wheeler's asked a question, is there any alternative to external wall insulation and internal wall insulation? And she's offered some sort of ideas around that. But Joanne, you were talking about using the lime mortar and using sort of more natural materials. I mean, what are the solutions that we see that are particularly relevant other than this for conservation area homes or historic buildings? And so what are some of those alternative solutions that people can look into? It's probably a tough question, but feel free to jump in.
That is a tough question. Sophie, I totally want to know what your ideas are. All for new ideas. Fantastic. Yeah, external insulation, we don't necessarily say no to it. As everyone's been saying, we've got to consider thermal bridging, you've got to consider party walls because you've got your neighbours to consider, you've got to consider interstitial condensation. External wall systems are not as difficult as internal, but they are extremely difficult to install. You would end up having to make your window frames come out, you'd have to change your doors, you'd have to change the eaves on your roof. And rainwater goods, and then internal you've got the problem if you've got a listed building with cornices and changing your plug sockets. We're not anti it though. If you want to do it, there are many materials out there that you can do it. I'm currently doing a study actually on insulated lime renders. So instead of you putting boarding in like wood fibre, you can actually just insulate your building via these plasters and renders. At the moment, it's a study process, but this is a topic that we might come to in 6 months with proof. We're testing it across about 15 different sites, and we might be able to turn around and go, this is a fantastic way to get the U value you need out of your walls. So I suppose the quickest answer for me is just keep watching Historic England Space. We are looking at this, and there are many options out there, and there always will be.
That's amazing. By the way, speakers, feel free to jump in on these. I'm just seeing that we've got a lot of questions and I'm trying to get a bit answered on all of them. So perhaps one for you, David. Neil Roth has mentioned that his 3 largest rooms are currently heated by gas room heaters and he doesn't have any central heating. Is it still possible that room heaters, which can also run on hydrogen, will eventually become available, or are there other solutions for him to think about?
Yeah, Worcester Bosch are, there's a something on the technical director and a guy called Roger Bisbee talking about using the existing gas infrastructure to and also sort of converting existing gas boilers to hydrogen. That's been talked about, and it's a possibility, but it's talk at the moment. But they're looking at hydrogen as another form of a way of heating, of using sort of existing gas boilers but retrofitting them.
Can I just add a point there, just from one of our directors who's an expert in this field. There's quite a lot of pressure against introducing hydrogen for home heating because it's much less energy efficient. I think the conversion is 1 to 4. So every 1 unit you use to power or to use hydrogen for home insulation, you burn up 4 units. So it's not as effective as other forms like air source heat pumps. So that's the latest thinking from the energy researchers. And actually, because we're going to be quite constrained in terms of renewables anyway, and we need to put the efforts into powering our systems first and transport and everything else. So the thinking is that hydrogen needs to be ring fence for those areas rather than used for gas central heating.
Really interesting point. Thanks, Camilla. Did you have anything else to add on that, David?
No, it's early stages. It's talk at the moment, but they are looking at it. But whether or not it will be implemented remains to be seen.
And just to reiterate what Carol said, of course, when we talk about hydrogen, it needs green hydrogen, and not to be kind of sidelined by all the sort of greenwash around other coloured hydrogens. It has to be green. It has to be powered by renewable energy.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
And Alex has her hand up as well, one of our directors.
Yeah, Neil's question was actually about he has gas room heaters. He doesn't have central heating. So he's talking about the room heaters running on green hydrogen or whatever hydrogen, that they could then run on those, rather than talking about converting the existing gas network and replacing boilers to also run on hydrogen. So it was a bit of a different question and it's been answered. So we could answer that. That'd be probably useful for Neil.
That would require some kind of storage of hydrogen within the dwelling, wouldn't it?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it would be like kind of like Calagas, but with super tight construction, because, you know, hydrogen storage is notoriously difficult because the size of the molecules it'll pretty much sort of seep out all over the place. And yeah, general thinking, as Camilla said, is that hydrogen for domestic usage probably won't be on the cards, but I have had a bit of a chat with Neil about he's sort of possibly open to an air source heat pump and some underfloor in things. And so, yeah, especially if you've got some roof space with a bit of PV to support that, that might be pretty cool. Anyway, I just wanted to answer Neil's question specifically.
Thank you. Yes, much appreciated. And before we, I guess, go too deep into the hydrogen space, I would like to jump down another rabbit hole, which is heat pumps. Now, we've heard the announcement about some funding for heat pumps coming out next year, hopefully. I can't remember who it was, I'm afraid, in the chat asked this question, but for older buildings, how much are heat pumps really the solution, and can they be the solution on their own without doing any other work? Everyone, I'm sure, will have comments on this, so please feel free to jump in.
So one thing, a lot of people don't know this about air source heat pumps. Please all tell me if I'm talking to you and you do know about it. Air source heat pumps traditionally work on very low heat modules, so they will get up to about 18 degrees. If you imagine in a traditional house that's had no insulation done, it's drafty because that's naturally what they do. We have natural ventilation in our traditional homes. You will find it harder for the air source heat pump to work. That said, we have got buildings that are listed that have had air source heat pumps installed and they do work, but it's not a case of just installing the air source heat pump. You also need to consider the factor you will need to likely put larger radiators in or underfloor heating, so you might lose some of your historic nature that way. So there's quite a bit that needs to be understood around air source heat pumps, but it is possible.
Okay, lovely. Any more comments on the heat pumps, or shall we move on to the next question? I think that was a really good summary. Okay, so Steve Jenkins says that he fully supports retrofit, but how do we prevent retrofit companies or installers from selling inappropriate solutions to conservation area residents when there are alternative approaches that are available that would maintain the significance of the asset, as well as, you know, doing the retrofit very well? So he's saying that conservation areas really lack the knowledge and the expertise to currently respond to installers that are suggesting the wrong kinds of solutions. I would say this is probably more of a landscape question, but Joanna, perhaps you could provide some guidance in terms of what the council are doing on in this space, in terms of the guidance that's being offered, and sort of pulling people down the right route if installers have told them about different solutions.
Well, in my area of work in the council, then we've got the draft local plan, which went out to consultation last year and has sustainability sections in it. We also have supplementary planning guidance on alterations and extensions, but that's a few years old, so it's probably behind the point that we are at the moment. We at a more local level, we have conservation area appraisals, and actually Brookmill and St John's, the neighbouring area, conservation area, are at the top of our priority list for producing the next batch of reviewed and new conservation area appraisals. So we're hoping to do that very soon. So this kind of conversation is really useful. Conservation area appraisals do tend to have a section on renewables and energy efficiency, and that's something that we're in a position to really focus on more now. Other parts of the council are doing more work on this, and I can't really speak for them, but we've obviously Lewisham declared the climate emergency, and there's a climate action plan that's been produced and a team that's working on that, so looking across the whole council as to how all of the council can be focusing on this. So I think that's for somebody else to speak about, but
Yeah.
there is lots going on across all the departments.
Thank you so much. And as you rightly highlighted, Lewisham Council will be attending the next webinar on the 9th to update us on their work in this space. So that's really helpful. But David, I mean, do you have any comments in terms of a retrofit coordinator's role in this kind of work?
Yeah, I mean, every property is different. Every client has a different set of priorities, and you should treat every client and every property differently. I mean, you can't just recommend the same thing for every property. They all have different characteristics. It's important to consider that people live in historic buildings and they want to maintain the look of that building. And you know, when you start playing around with the equilibrium of that building, the way it sort of dries and gets wet and dries out, then the risk goes up when you start retrofitting, and you have to manage that really carefully.
And have you ever dealt with sort of when a client's been advised by their installer to...
Don't listen to the installer. Don't listen to the installer. The whole role of the retrofit coordinator is to be the custodian of truth. So he will guide the contractor and not be, pushed along by him. So it's the installer has a business model. They have to make a profit. The retrofit coordinator is looking after the client's interest and the building's interest.
All right, lovely. That is very, very clear, a very clear picture for us. So last question that I have for you guys, and apologies we haven't managed to get to all the questions in the chat, but I think this is a really sort of important one to round us off. What do you think the government should be doing in the next 2 to 3 years to push this forwards, to make sure conservation areas are supported in retrofit? Big question, I know.
More money. More money needs to be thrown at it, not a piffling £5 for a heat pump. That's not a solution.
Changing VAT rules would be helpful. At the moment, alterations such as retrofit are charged at standard rate, whereas new builds have lower VAT. So that's a key one.
Thank you. And Alfie, any more comments on this?
Well, I was going to echo what Joanna just said, although that's not Historic England's official position. I'm putting that personally. The VAT charge is clearly a disincentive, and that's really bad. I think also just generally there's a policy challenge. It takes a long time to produce policy, but policy isn't really up to speed. It really needs to be better integrated, and I'd argue in our field for climate change adaptation policy to be better integrated with historic environment policy, which it isn't yet. But that's slow work. So we have to rely on kind of expertise and experimentation in the meantime.
Interesting. And Joanne, any sort of final comments on that space?
That's quite hard because you've all covered it really well. Do you know what? One thing I'd love is if we had more conservation officers, maybe for local authorities, to give them all support. They're really overstretched. More people in Historic England would be great, so we can really keep you guys informed and we can do more work. So yeah, that'd be probably my plug to government.
That's great. So a bit of policy, a bit of funding, a bit of sort of skills and knowledge investment as well there. So I think that's a really, really sort of lovely way to round off the discussion. Thank you all so much for joining, and thank you everyone for the questions in the comments. I am going to pass it back to Julia to round us off here and finish up this webinar.
Thank you very much, Nadia, and thank you again to our panelists. Really fantastic on the ball responses, and apologies again that we didn't get through all the questions. Can I suggest, if people are interested in the discussions in the chat, that you save the chat, and usually there are 3 little dots at the bottom that you can save the chat, but I can't seem to see mine.
We'll send around we can send around the chat in an email afterwards, along with the materials that everyone
and you're going to send the materials and the links. And also, Alfie, you mentioned a book, and I didn't catch the name of the author, about the history of energy, which sounded fascinating.
I mean, there are lots of resources, and I'd be happy to, I think we all would, to write up various links to share if that's useful. But the one I was mentioning was by Barnabas Calder. It's just come out, published by Pelican, and it's called A History of Architecture from Something to Climate Emergency. I've forgotten the title fully. It's a few months old.
Well, maybe you could put it in your notes, and then everybody can have that. That would be great. I mean, I just found this really so valuable because it's coalesced lots of issues clearly, and although it hasn't solved what I will do next week in terms of my own efforts to retrofit my little terraced house, I think it's raised some really interesting ideas, like the offset funds, the potential for conservation areas and their importance potentially as a priority for addressing the older range of our housing stock, changing VAT. I just would also like to know, and if anybody would like to message us subsequently, about what conservation areas societies could be doing to perhaps take forward the work of Historic England, and particularly lobbying for the resourcing of changes that people are eager to make. So I think it just suffices me to say that our next webinar is on Tuesday, the 9th of November from 7 o'clock to 9 o'clock. And that will focus on practical approaches to retrofit. And we'll have another speaker from Historic England, Sarah Freeman, who in fact is undertaking her own retrofit in Bourneville to conservation standards, and an architect experienced in projects in conservation areas who's based in South London, Harry Patikas, of Arboreal Architecture, and as Nadia mentioned earlier, a councillor from Lewisham, Louise Krupski, will be talking about the current retrofit work in public buildings in the borough. So that may be useful also for people who don't live in Lewisham, just to get a comparator. So that's it, folks. Thanks very much for attending and for your donations, and we hope to see you at the beginning on the 9th of November. Thank you very much.